Hello, my name is David Brett. I'm the editor of the New Westminster Times. I have a question for you today. Have you grown weary of decolonization? Are you sick and tired of name changes? Streets, bridges, schools, buildings. Are you tired of monuments being removed, statues being toppled, and generally the history of British Columbia being rewritten so that certain figures of history are denigrated and thrown into the dustbin of history with a bad report? I'm going to talk about that today and suggest a way for people to push back on decolonization in a way I think you're going to find very surprising and somewhat mind-blowing. So before I get into that, I'm just going to say that I'm going to talk about a place called Powell River on the Upper Sunshine Coast of BC and a man named Israel Wood Powell. And before I talk about that, I'm going to talk about New Westminster. So where am I today? I am at a place that is incredibly important in the history of British Columbia, and it is brought up in the Cowichan decision itself, and the backdrop, provides a backdrop of how the Cowichan decision was arrived at, and it has a big reflection on issues surrounding DRIPA and the relationship with Indigenous people in British Columbia then and today. This place is called Sapperton Landing. Behind me is a building, the red building is the old warehouse of the BC Penitentiary. And this place was also the location of the encampment of the Royal Engineers. New Westminster was the capital of the colony of British Columbia. And Governor James Douglas, who had left office, was replaced by a new governor, Frederick Seymour. So in 1864, Governor Seymour decided to hold a special event here in New Westminster to kick off his governorship on the Queen's birthday, Queen Victoria, on May 24th, 1864, he held a meeting here, and he invited First Nations people. So at this big convocation, there were 4,000 Indigenous people, 700 to 800 canoes that had come down the Fraser River. As you can see, we're near the Patello Bridge in the background over here. Now, I want you to imagine 700 canoes coming down the river and assembling at this location on this flat part of land. "4,000 people is a large number. The Queen Elizabeth Theatre seating holds about 2,700 to 2,800 people. So you have a crowd of Indigenous people, including 80-odd chiefs who were assembled here. Why were they here? They were here to honor Queen Victoria. So at this meeting, Governor Seymour, there was a great pomp and circumstances, there was gifts given, and there was all kinds of special words and speeches given, and the whole point was to set the tone for the relationship with Indigenous people between Seymour and the Indigenous communities of BC, because Governor James Douglas had enjoyed a tremendous relationship, and his reputation amongst First Nations people was very strong. So he wanted to get kicked off on the right foot. But you imagine this. Just days before this event, right here at Sapperton Landing, which was the seat of government of the colony of British Columbia, there was a terrible event that happened on the coast of BC in Butte Inlet. There had come word that Chilcotin people had slaughtered over a dozen. Some 20 people in a road crew had been killed. And word of this had just arrived. So imagine, here's Governor Seymour holding forth and trying to create a special relationship with First Nations people. And there had been this massacre. So he gave a speech. And that speech was one where he made certain promises to the people. And a promise of making sure that their reserve lands were not encroached upon and that their rights would be respected. And it was generally to be a way to create goodwill. Now, this tradition of First Nations people coming to New Westminster to gather here to celebrate the Queen's birthday was a regular occurrence. And in the Cowichan decision, the judge refers to a similar meeting that took place here in 1873. This would have been after Confederation and after the capital had moved from New Westminster to Victoria. So in her ruling, the judge states, on May 26, 1873, 4,000 Indigenous people assembled at New Westminster for celebrations of the Queen's birthday. And then, as was often the case, this was an opportunity for the Indigenous people to bring their grievances before the government and make an appeal to the Queen herself. So it says, in a petition presented to Israel Wood Powell, who was the first Superintendent of Indian Affairs for British Columbia, there was 70 signatories stated on behalf of the Little Lower Fraser and Butte Inlet Indians that, and this is a quote from their petition, "The white men have taken our land and no compensation has been given us, though we have been told many times that the great Queen was so good she would help her distant children, the Indians. White men have surrounded our villages so much as in many instances, especially on the Fraser River, but few acres of land have been left to us." And now here's the point at which I'm going to talk about Israel Wood Powell and Powell River. So it's also recorded by the judge's ruling, the response, the way in which the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Israel Wood Powell, responded. So shortly after the meeting in June, Powell wrote to the Lieutenant Governor, Trutch, and he said, and this is a quote, "I have to address Your Honor in the respect of the urgent necessity of adjusting existing Indian reserves, extending them where required, and of setting apart Indian land for tribes now not provided for, and should the arrangements proposed by the Dominion government be satisfactory to the government of the province, that I am now ready to proceed with the necessary surveys." He went on, he says, "I'm informed that in different places just visited by me, that in some instances great injustice has been done to the Indians in not reserving sufficient land for their use, and in some cases such as Comox, Shumatas, etc., land actually occupied by Indians as potato patches has been preempted by white settlers and certificates granted. So here's a man who has heard the petition of the Indigenous people right here at Sapperton Landing, where there was a regatta. This is something that should be mentioned, that the canoes were not just there for transportation. They participated in canoe races. And these canoe races, believe it or not, were also held in Westminster as recently as the 1960s. In 1966 and 67, and we'll show you pictures of this, there was something called Indian Days. So, but I digress. So, here we have Israel Wood Powell going to bat for the Indigenous people of this province in the 1870s. So you would think that due to this advocacy on his part to provide reserves where none were granted and to make reserves bigger than they were before would be celebrated by Indigenous people today as a great hero. Well, here's the thing. A few years ago, the Tla'amin First Nation, formerly called the Tla'amin in Powell River, made a formal request to the City Council to change the name of Powell River to another name. Why? Why did they do that? Well, their grievance is, and get this, it relates to residential schools. And in research and articles that have been written by the New Westminster Times, by myself, a great deal of research has been done by our paper on the goings-on in Powell River. Here's the thing. The name change issue in Powell River was not a priority to the chief and council there of the Tla'amin, who, by the way, had signed a treaty that was negotiated in the mid-2010s, and I think it was around 2016 they signed a treaty. Took years to negotiate. Well, what I'm saying is it has come to light that the catalyst for demanding the name change was the Kamloops revelation about 215 unmarked graves of children. That's why they asked for and they're demanding the name change. So their grievance against Powell is that he was an advocate for education. It's well known that he didn't really advocate strictly for the education of Indigenous people. He proposed that there be all British Columbia children be provided a 100% free secular education, not religious education, secular education. So he was a great champion of education. So it's only natural that he would want to put in place a system that provided for the education of Indigenous people. So clearly, based on what is in the judge's ruling, which was put forth really as evidence to support the Cowichan claim that insufficient reserves had been, there were deficiencies in the granting of reserves. This is sort of the case that was made. And here's Powell going to bat for them, saying, yeah, let's remedy this problem. So why are they trying to scrub his name? Well, I'm getting to my main point about cancel culture, about decolonization, and how to push back on this. The beleaguered people of Powell River who have pushed back on the name change, there's a huge contingent of the townsfolk who are just livid that this is being thrust upon them by the First Nation and the woke majority of the City Council. So the status now is that they're going to hold what they call an opinion poll coincident with the 2026 October municipal elections to determine what's going to happen next with the name change. But part of the problem is the mainstream media have been all over the Powell River decision and championing this name change and jumping on board kind of like a free PR department for the Tla'amin First Nation to paint Powell as a villain. Well, not here, not in 1873. He wasn't a villain. So how did he become a villain? It connects to Kamloops and the now dubious claim of unmarked graves, which is sort of mushroomed into this claim of thousands and thousands of unmarked graves, supposedly, in an archipelago across Canada. So the Powell River situation is emblematic of what's happening across the province. The folks that are pushing back on the name change, every trick in the book has been pulled out. They have been smeared as racists, as residential school denialists, as white supremacists. Every label you can imagine has been applied to them. And people have lost their jobs. We will share with you a link to a story about a man named Ted Vizzuti, a lifetime paramedic who was one of the best in the business, basically bullied right on out of his career because he opposed the name change and he just wanted a democratic process. I mean, the folks who are opposing the name change say, look, if everyone in the town votes a majority in favor of the name change, well, we've had a democratic process. But the democratic process, the First Nation, doesn't want to vote. They think they should just change the name out of respect for them because Powell was such a bad guy. The other thing they complain about Powell is that they allege that he, quote, stole artifacts from the territory because he did travel up and down the coast and throughout the province. And he was, I wouldn't say the record shows he was a, quote, collector. He ended up acquiring, either by sale or by gift, items, artistic items, carvings, cultural artifacts that he seems to have been motivated by a desire to preserve them in museums because in this wet and wild country, these wooden objects don't necessarily survive. So, how is it then this cancel culture, which applies to the Pattullo Bridge right over there, they look to rename it, and barely a day goes by where something isn't being renamed. There we have the old Pattullo Bridge and the new one is coming in, and it was a great ceremony was held to apply a new Indigenous name to the bridge. It's likely most people will just simply call it the Pattullo Bridge going forward. So here is the surprising way in which the decolonization agenda, this name change mania, can be pushed back upon. And here's the method. It's called DRIPA. It's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That's right. DRIPA itself is a tool to push back on all of this decolonial narrative. I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from DRIPA that are very important for people to understand. It's 3 paragraphs, and these are very key. It says in UNDRIP, the United Nations document, it says, affirming that Indigenous people are equal to all other peoples while recognizing the right of all peoples to be different, to consider themselves different, and to be respected as such. Affirming also that all peoples contribute to the diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures which constitute the common heritage of humankind. Let me read that last paragraph again. Affirming also that all peoples contribute to the diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures which constitute the common heritage of mankind. The key word being all peoples. And the final paragraph I'll read is affirming further that all doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origin or racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. So that stands to reason. The concept of the superiority of one ethnic group over another is to be rejected. The superiority of one culture over another culture is strictly forbidden under UNDRIP. Now, we're at a time where people are calling for the repeal of UNDRIP, and perhaps it's likely that it will be repealed. But before it's repealed, these paragraphs from UNDRIP basically make it virtually illegal in this province to destroy culture. So what is culture? So the names of places, like my city, where are you from? I'm from Powell River. What is the culture of this town? What is the history of the town? It's all bound up in the name of the town. So if you look to kind of destroy and repudiate the culture of any one people, that is contrary to DRIPA. You can't repudiate or tear at the fabric of one culture and replace it with another culture. This is something that is very maddening to the people of Powell River. They've various institutions and organizations have already renamed themselves without any manner of public consultation. For example, the school district used to be the Powell River School District, is now the Cathet School District. The hospital used to be the Powell River Hospital, now it's the Cathet Hospital. Cathet means, I can't remember what it means. I think it means peace. So people in Powell River are not feeling very peaceful. They're feeling that they're being violated. So, if you have a gut feeling that all of these name changes and all of these changes and repudiation of the history of British Columbia just doesn't sit right with you, there's a reason for that. This is what I think it is. It's a form of abuse. This expression, gaslighting, I think is terribly overused. But in this instance, I would say the population is being subjected to gaslighting. What is gaslighting? It is when something bad is being done to you. You are being abused, but the abuser makes it sound like it's your fault. Oh, you don't like this new name? Well, that's because you're a racist. Oh, you can't pronounce this street name? Well, that's because you're too stupid, you're ignorant, or slow, or old. And that last one really cuts deep. You're too old. You're not willing to change. You're a boomer. You're a senior. You're from a different era. You're not caught up with the times. You're not adapting. You're not modernizing. What's wrong with you? Why can't you change? Do you hate change? Are you afraid of change? We all have to embrace change. Why aren't you embracing change? That's all gaslighting. Because under UNDRIP, the culture of all peoples is to be respected. You cannot come say that, well, my school, there's a school in town here just up the hill. It's called Sir Richard McBride School. Well, it's now been changed to an indigenous name that means sea otter, and it's pronounced Scowench. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. But most people of a certain age still call it Richard McBride, and they swear they'll never call it the new name. They don't want to have it forced down their throats because it's contrary to the spirit of UNDRIP. And this is something that I think is very important for people to understand. People criticize the United Nations, as I do, and I think it's an organization that has somewhat fallen into disrepute for many reasons. All the climate change hype, a lot of it goes back to them. The way they treat Israel, and then there's so many injustices that seem to spring in. It's this massive bureaucracy that seems to have a life of its own. But one thing they seem, in my opinion, to get right is this matter of cultural rights. And there is something called the UNESCO 2003 Convention on the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. So if you look at that, there's a couple of hundred countries that are signatories to it. Canada is not a signatory, and this intangible cultural heritage and the possible ratification of the Safeguarding Convention of 2003 became an issue in BC politics when the BC NDP sought to do what they called the Heritage Conservation Act Transformation Project. They were trying to shoehorn intangible cultural heritage into the legislation here, which on the face of it is actually a very good idea. The problem is they were doing it in such a way as to impinge on and impact land rights. They're trying to say that, and I've done a lot of studying of the ICH rules and laws because this place, New Westminster, is a place of a lot of intangible cultural heritage that has been thrown under the bus. Frankly, right now it's been subject to cancel culture. So this concept that cultural rights are inherent human rights. They have this phrase, cultural rights are human rights. So if you feel deep down that something wrong is going on, it's because your cultural rights are being taken away from you without your consent. That's exactly what the UNDRIP legislation was supposed to be all about. Do we want to take away the cultural rights of Indigenous people? No, we don't want to do that. That's something that we believe is right. Something else I want to say about all of this is that nowhere in the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report reference changing names of streets, removing monuments, reputing any particular figure of Canadian history, not Sir John A. Macdonald. The 94 calls to action do not call for the statue of Judge Begbie to be removed, or Ryerson, or Macdonald, or Captain Cook, or it doesn't call for radicals to go out and spray paint the statue of Captain Vancouver in front of Vancouver City Hall. Zero mention of that. What is mentioned? The word education appears 28 times. The word health appears over 20 times. It's about education, health care, and proper access. Now, the calls to action do mention the UNDRIP. But if you read the actual wording, it's clear that it's supposed to be about the principles underlying UNDRIP. It's not supposed to be about trying to make a rule that applies in law to everything. That's not what I read in it. A couple of other surprising things in the 94 calls to action is an affirmation of the proclamation of King George of 1763. It also talks about the pledge, the affirmation that new arrivals to Canada, new citizens, you have to pledge allegiance to Her Majesty the Queen, or the sovereign, whoever the sovereign is at that time. They were not looking to repudiate the crown. So, finally, what I'll say, being here in New Westminster, the irony of all this is so thick that it's incredible. 4,000 Indigenous people came here in 1864. And over the period of time when this was the seat of government, thousands of Indigenous people came here to pay their respects to the Queen, to look at the Queen as a revered figure. So the relationship between Indigenous people and the government was supposed to be a relationship with the Queen. This is why New Westminster was actually named by Queen Victoria and has become known as the Royal City. The logo of the city has been for many years a crown. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So, what does the woke city council, the NDP-backed, Labour-backed council of New Westminster do a few years ago? They repudiate the crown. They say, we're dropping the Royal City moniker and we're going to replace the crown logo. Why? They say, whoa, well, it's offensive to Indigenous people. Really? Have they done their homework? Why would they say that? Well, here's the reason. They could care less about reconciliation. They're not in the reconciliation business. They're in the decolonization business. They're for renaming everything. They're for repudiating every figure that is symbolic of what? The colonial, capitalist, patriarchal, white supremacist system of oppression that has been created to marginalize those who do not benefit from the status quo. These are the talking points of those who are gaslighting you, They say, oh, well, and I'll leave you with this. If you are of a certain age, if you grew up in British Columbia, if you have memories, and you have a fondness for the history of this province, that is a good thing, because I was born and raised here, mostly along the Fraser River. British Columbia is different than the rest of Canada. There is a unique culture here, and a lot of it can be found right here in the Westminster. May Day is the longest running May Day in the British Commonwealth, still happens right here. There's something called the Hayek Anvil Battery, a salute to the Queen. They call it the Ancient and Honorable Hayek Anvil Battery. There are pockets of culture, the logging, the resource extraction industry, fishing, and these are cultures that have been imported from Europe, but they have been transformed in a special way, which is very unique. One other historical fact about what happened here at Sapperton Landing is that the Indigenous people were communicated to in a language which is very unique to this world. It's called Chinook Wawa. It was a trade language, which was so. This language is part and parcel of this part of this province. We have words like skookumchuck. The word hayak is ubiquitous in New Westminster. You come into New Westminster, you see this word hayak everywhere. What does that mean? It is an Indigenous word that means go fast. We have the word saltchuck. So a lot of the words, the language, and this is one of the key elements of intangible cultural heritage that the UNESCO Safeguarding Agreement is trying to protect. So the culture of Indigenous people in this part of the world is largely intangible because very little survives of built heritage. Wooden buildings, they don't, 50 years, 100 years, unless they're covered with paint and roofs, they disappear. So this is the key message. So for the people in Powell River, you should follow these stories. Follow what's happening in Powell River. And finally, I keep saying finally, and this is critical. Who knows when there's going to be an election, a provincial election in British Columbia? We don't know. There could be one called, and then we'll be thrust into election. But one thing is for sure, come October 2026, there are municipal elections. That means school boards and city councils. A lot of the cancel culture, the name changes, like the school name changes that are happening are boiling out of the woke school trustee meetings. So you elect a bunch of woke school trustees. Well, what do people expect? May Day in New Westminster was basically canceled by the school board. The NDP labor-backed councillors, the woke councillors got in, and they just shut it down. After 150 years, they just walked away because they said it didn't align with their values. What does that mean? That's gaslighting. Oh, well, I guess you don't share our values because we're all about inclusion and equity. You're not about that, so you're a bad person. So, and the municipal government here is the one going around. We have a new logo here. It's a tugboat. Everyone is very disappointed, and all this money was spent on this rebranding exercise, and it's just emblematic of a kind of cultural gaslighting and a cultural abuse of the vast. No one asked for for the royal city moniker to go away. It wasn't an election issue. No one voted for it. It was just like, too bad. You're racist. That's why you don't want it. See, and the social media abuse that comes from the left is just unbelievable. The amount of times the word racist, white supremacist, and all the swear words and four-letter words that are just dumped and heaped upon anyone who would dare speak up against the cancel culture. So, there's one more thing I wanted to talk about before I move on. And this will truly shock you. So, this last paragraph of the UNDRIP document about the prohibition, effectively, on advocating that one group is superior to another. Well, isn't that what white people have done all these times? Well, when I started writing about the name change in Powell River, I was contacted by a former chief of the Tla'amin named Maynard Harry. And he was very displeased with my coverage because I wasn't coming out in favor of the name change. So here's what he said to me. He says, the white people in Canada are subhuman because of what they've allowed to happen. And now this man is no slouch. He has a consulting company that runs seminars called Colonizer Rehab. And he's hired by big organizations to give these speeches and lead people in this concept of decolonization. He went on and he said, white people need to acknowledge their culture is lost. White settler culture is a lost culture because nothing good defines white people. If I insult white people, I don't give a bleep. Now, people in Powell River with the Tla'amin have doubted that he actually said this. I have the recording. I have the transcript. He said the word subhuman 13 times in a conversation with me. So, what am I getting at? There is something happening in British Columbia at this time, and possibly throughout other parts of the Western world, that sees Indigenous people as an exceptional people that are, frankly, superior to the rest of the population. Now, it's sort of an anthropological belief that Indigenous ways of knowing are in some way superior to Western ways of knowing. So, in other words, we're going to decolonize science. We're going to look at the world in a different way. Well, ultimately, it all comes back to the supposed white European Western concept of resource extraction. We're going to go, we're going to, knock the mountain down and suck all the minerals out of them and pull the resources of these humans. This view of humanity as wasting and rapaciously devouring all of the resources of the earth, as opposed to Indigenous ways of knowing, which is more reciprocal. This idea that, we don't take more than we need. Well, is that really true? It's all part of what I refer to is the woke religion. Wokeness is not just a political set of policies. It is underlined by a religious worldview, and I've talked about this before, a kind of a combination of the social gospel and New Age religion. There's Indigenous spirituality, but that's just one ingredient that's poured into the New Age concoction of spiritual traditions from around the world. It's a bit of Buddhism, it's Hinduism, it's transcendental meditation, it's Zen Buddhism, it's yoga, it's body work, it's wellness, it's 1,000 different spiritual traditions that basically believe they have kind of a Christian mission to, exalt and lift up Indigenous people, so people will join outward bound style courses, and they'll take, they call it rewilding. You got to rewild yourself. You got to get out in the bush. You got to learn how to build, make your own clothes, and start a fire from friction with wood. Or you got to start. You basically got to indigenize yourself, physically and mentally. Why? Because when people think, if you bring it back to UNDRIP and the idea that there are no superior races, cultures, or religions, our culture is not taking that part of UNDRIP seriously. If you look at it, it really is a leveling of everything. So that's my message to you today. What UNDRIP is being used to do in culture to upend property rights, to overthrow the mineral tenure system, to extract outrageous sums, billions and billions of dollars in transfers from taxpayers and corporations to Indigenous people. That and all of these rules and reconciliation concepts are being used for something that UNDRIP was never really meant to do in the first place. So with that, I will leave you at this amazing location. You've got the SkyTrain and trains, and it's an incredibly busy place now. But it's a beautiful park, and people should come here and contemplate what happened here in 1864. And imagine the thousands of Indigenous people here to honor Queen Victoria. And that really is the message, is that there's a mutual respect here, and the Crown, and there was a lot of Frederick Seymour, in his speech, he referred to good Indians and bad Indians. Now, why did he say that? It seems kind of cruel. Well, they had just experienced, the news had just hit town, that over a dozen people were murdered in a road crew, innocent civilians, killed in their sleep and their body parts thrown in the river. It was a horrible shock to the entire colony. It's like, good grief. And there were only 10, 20,000 people living in British Columbia at the time. I mean, the Indigenous people outnumbered the white people. You can imagine what of a shock it would have been that happened. Anyway, that's my message. Don't be gaslit. And if you're a certain age, if you're getting older and you are wistfully remembering good memories of living in this province and growing up here, relish that. Don't be ashamed of it. Write it down. You have stories? Write your stories. Put them in journals. This is something that should be celebrated. The culture of BC is an amazing culture. It's an amazing place. My name is David Brett. I'm the editor of the New Westminster Times. If you enjoy what we're doing at the New Westminster Times, you appreciate our journalism, I invite you to support our work. You can go to newwesttimes.com. Up in the right-hand corner, there's a button that says support our work. If you would feel so inclined to support us, that would be much appreciated. You can also subscribe to our newsletter and get the written articles that come out from time to time. Thanks again for watching.